common saying among web developers is that CSS is simple but not easy, and this statement becomes more and more true as a project grows both in scale and in complexity. Hi, my name is Peter, I'm a front-end developer at Astrolabs Dubai, and I'm going to show you how you can improve your code by applying a styling methodology called Object-Oriented CSS. Before we move on to the topic at hand, a few words about Astrolabs. Our mission is to drive the MENA region's growth into a world-class digital and entrepreneurial ecosystem. We work on several different verticals: academy, where we run multiple tech courses such as full-stack web development, data science, practical data analysis, digital marketing, and more. We do corporate training, where we provide upskilling courses, managed incubators, custom physical and virtual programs designed to support large organizations through their digital transformation. We are partnered with the DMCC Free Zone in the UAE and the Ministry of Investment in Saudi Arabia to fast-track your company's licensing process. And last but not least, we provide co-working spaces, both in the United Arab Emirates and in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Okay, so what is Object-Oriented CSS? Well, CSS itself was designed to be simple and intuitive. And front-end developers, yes, do generally agree that CSS is in fact simple, but it's not exactly easy, especially when a project grows both in scale and complexity. So to make things more maintainable, flexible, to improve development speed, CSS methodologies were introduced. Now, these are not separate technologies, but more of a set or multiple sets of best practices to follow, and Object-Oriented CSS is one such methodology. There are two main rules we need to follow within Object-Oriented CSS. Number one, separation of structure and skin. You can think of structure properties as instructions for the size and position of elements, such as height, width, margins, paddings, and skin properties are the visual aspects of elements, such as colors, fonts, or shadows. Let me show you how you can apply the separation of structure and skin in practice. Here we have a very simple layout of 3 buttons, and each of them has their own separate class, and those classes have styles assigned to them. So we have an apply class for the blue button, deny class for the red one, and the join class for the green button. And as you can see from the CSS, we have a lot of repetition here, right? Basically, the only thing different in each of those classes is the background: blue, red, green. This also means that whenever we want to create a new button, we would need to create a new class for it and then retype or copy all of this code again if we want to have some consistency, as in if we want our buttons to have the same width, same border radius, and so on. Within Object-Oriented CSS, we take a different approach. We would make a class called button, for example, and this is where we will put our structure. So we will take the width, the height, the border radius, and the border. Technically, you could argue that you should maybe put the border itself in the skin, not in the structure, but I think it's more important to follow the guidelines of a methodology that make your life easier rather than sticking to it 100% all of the time. So we're gonna keep our border in the structure class. And then we're gonna declare some classes for the backgrounds. And because we might wanna use those backgrounds not only for buttons, we're not gonna call them like button red and so on. We're gonna call this class background blue for the first one, and we're just gonna assign it the blue color. We're gonna do it similarly for the other two. Red and green. That's it. Okay, and we're gonna assign these classes here. So we're gonna remove this one. The start will update in a moment. Just how the open works. Okay, class button. Yeah. It has now assigned our structure, and let's give it the background blue, peachy blue. Go. We're gonna do the same for the rest. Just make this one red, this one green, assign these classes, and there we go. Okay, so this is the classic approach. This is the object-oriented approach, object-oriented CSS approach. Not only did it take us less code, fewer lines of code to write it, it's also much more reusable, because now, whenever we want to make a new button, let's say we'd like to have a yellow one at some point, okay? So we'll just make a button, call it yellow for now. Let's call it alert. Okay. Now all we need to do is to create a PG yellow class and the background of we can do one more thing here. We can actually add a font color to each of those classes. So every time we have a blue background, or a red background, or a green background, the font is gonna be white. Now I don't think we should do that for the yellow one. No, not really. For the yellow one, we'll keep it like this. We could also take a different approach and create a star called text white, for example, and just put the color here. Then we could remove it from, say, blue, other ones, and assign it here. But totally depends on our approach, depends on the project. In this case, we can just stick to having it here. Okay, let's add some more elements to our small design here, our small layout. Let's say we want to have some cards. Okay, so let's create a div, give it a class of card, and let's give it some text. Close the div. And we want 3 of those, so we're just gonna copy it like this. Just change the text inside, so some more text and even more text here. We're gonna define or assign styles to the class. Let's give it a height of 300 pixels and a width of 300 pixels as well. And let's give them colors, or assign the skin classes we created earlier. That's gonna give them the colors we want. So let's say we want the first one to be green. So we're gonna go with background green. We're gonna go with background yellow for the second one, and with background blue for the last one. Okay. Now we would like our cards to be in a row instead of stacked like this. For the purpose of this, we can create another structure class, and we're gonna call it grid, because that's the type of layout we're gonna apply here. Okay. Yeah, so we just assign the styles to the grid class. Display, yeah, you guessed it, it's gonna be grid. And since we want them to be in columns, we're gonna go with grid template columns. And for this layout, and this part is pretty dependent on the elements we have and how reusable we want the code to be. But let's say we're gonna go repeat repeat, and yeah, I think out of it will be out of it. Min max, there are 300 pixels, so 300 pixels and 1 R. Yeah, looks decent. It's gonna be responsive as well. Oh, but we do want them to be in the center too. To be always in the center, so justify items, center. There we go. And one more thing. It's also completely responsive. But one more thing we would want is to have some spacing between our buttons and our grid. And we could just add this to the grid class with the padding top, for example, of 2 rem. Okay, but let's say we want this 2 rem spacing to be our default spacing between sections we put in our app. So we could have some text under this, we could have some sliders, some more buttons, a footer, whatever. And we always want to be 2 rem. And because we don't want to repeat the styles, we'll just remove this from here. We'll create a new class, call it P2, put it here, and assign the P2 class right here to the parent element of the cards. Okay, so using object-oriented CSS, we have also created a grid container that we could reuse anywhere in our app. Let's say you get a design and you can identify multiple grids, multiple cards. Let's say those can be products, and further down in the app it can be comments, or another section structured with cards. You can define the class beforehand and then just apply it wherever you need it, making the code much more reusable. Alright, that was the separation of structure and skin. Now, the second rule of object-oriented CSS is the separation of container and content, which basically means that you should avoid nesting styles and using pseudo-classes. Okay, separation of containers and content in practice. I've written out all of the code beforehand. There's quite a bit more of it than in the previous example, so I just went ahead and typed it all out. Also, you can find the link to both this and the previous project in the description. So what we have here is a sidebar and a content area. Going into the CSS, on the top we have some style resets that are always a good idea to include, whether you're working with object-oriented CSS or using some other methodology, or not even no methodology at all, because if you remove them, this is what you're gonna get, because you don't want that. So we just reapply them. Okay, with using classic CSS, what would we have? We would have a sidebar class with a background, a width, a height, and position absolute. Now there are multiple other ways we could achieve this sort of layout. For the purpose of this video, however, I decided to go with position absolute. Sidebar H3 is what I was talking about when I mentioned nesting styles. So what we are doing here is we are targeting the sidebar and sidebar right here, and then going towards H3 child element. So basically from sidebar to H3. That's how a nested selector like this works. We do the same for the unordered list and the list item. And on the bottom here we have a pseudo class. So we're going into the sidebar, into the UL, the unordered list, into the list item, but we're only targeting the first of types. So the first list item in the unordered list, which is inside our sidebar class. This This selector, the pseudo class, exists for a reason. It quite often can be very useful. For example, if you have a site, an app that has dynamically rendered content from the backend, from the server side, and you want a style to always be applied, a certain style to always be applied to the last element being rendered, the last few elements or the first element, then selectors of this type, pseudo classes of this type, can come in very handy. You can use first of type, last of type, first child, last child, nth child. There's a lot of them, trust me. But you have to be quite careful when using them in general, because if the syntax of the structure of your HTML changes, you add more elements, you rearrange them, then you might need to redo large parts of your CSS flow. And you would want to avoid that, ideally to save development time and to make your code more maintainable. That's why we can use object-oriented CSS. Okay, because with this approach, we would follow the first rule, so the separation of structure and skin, and we would extract that in the sidebar class, where we would put the width and the height. Okay, sidebar right here. We would assign it background blue. We would give it position absolute, which we also extracted into a separate class, because it's quite likely that, well, if our app was bigger, if this was an actual project, we would have other elements that we would like to assign position absolute to. So with this, we can just type it in the HTML. You even have to swap to CSS to assign that style here. Okay, and we give it text center, because we want all the text elements in our sidebar to be centered horizontally. Okay, we apply the font white class to our h3 element, as well as a font 22, which gives it the size of 22 pixels to basically indicate this is the header or the title of our list. To the list itself, we apply list style none, which is very common when using lists in HTML. You pretty much always remove the styling, so you can just extract this to a separate class here, and whenever you make an ordered list, just include that class right here. As for the list items themselves, we give them a font of 20 right here. We give each padding of 10 pixels, and we want the cursor to turn into a pointer when a user hovers over them, in order to indicate that they are clickable, because this is a menu. We want it to be clickable. Yeah, and we do have a pseudo class at the bottom. Okay, I did mention that you should avoid using pseudo classes in object-oriented CSS, with the exception, however, of user action pseudo classes, which include hover and focus, for example. So when the user, in this case me, performs an action and hovers over an item, it changes a background color. If we had like text input field right here, when the user would click it, that input would become focused, and we would apply a focus pseudo class, making the input bigger, giving it some kind of border, basically applying whichever style we like. All right. Yeah, we have some code for JavaScript. I just put all the styling in one ID selector, not even a class, but this is just for JavaScript. So what you see here alongside of the class names is an ID for each list item and for the content area right here, solely for the purpose of JavaScript. For CSS, it's always better to use classes, well, because you can reuse a class. An ID you can only have one of a kind, but you still use IDs to target elements with JavaScript. The unclick is an event that occurs when a user clicks any of these list items. Okay, so like this, item 2, item 3, and so on. We have a font bold class assigned to the first list element at the start, because that's where we would like the app to be in default when you open it. And with JavaScript, when using object-oriented CSS, it's like manipulating the classes, so assigning the font weight here to our sidebar is as easy as just accessing the class list, adding and removing it. So you could think of that as well, an additional bonus of using object-oriented CSS that it might make working with JavaScript smoother. Okay, to sum it all up, why should you give object-oriented CSS a go? Well, in addition to the benefits I mentioned before, you could, for example, create a style sheet full of your own custom styles with font sizes, colors, backgrounds, borders, shadows, margins, paddings, whatever you want to put in there. And then you could just reuse that in any of your projects. I mean, that's basically how Bootstrap works, and it is a very popular styling framework for a reason. Also, object-oriented methodology has its roots in programming languages and is merely adopted by this CSS approach, so understanding it and getting a better grip of it might make it easier to learn programming languages such as Ruby, for example. Object-oriented CSS does have a few downsides. Firstly, the number of classes assigned to elements will increase when comparing to classic CSS because of the separation of styles, and this might look quite confusing for people unfamiliar with object-oriented CSS principles. Secondly, it might be unnecessary to use this approach for small projects where styles aren't being reapplied often or at all for that matter. And lastly, it does require some planning. So if you get a design, for example, you need to abstract the styles you will be reusing. So the paddings, border radius, spacing, colors, and so on. But I can tell you from my own personal experience that once you get past that learning curve, object-oriented CSS is a very valuable tool in your styling arsenal.